Now in Springfield, there is a lot going on and at a very fast pace with the newly elected Governor J.B. Pritzker. And joining me now is State Senator Jason Baricikman to talk about a few of these things, one of which minimum wage. Obviously, this is a huge conversation that has really picked up speed. The Senate already passed it through. Now the House has the chance to look at what it's going to do, $15 an hour by 2025. That's what is currently on the table. Where do you stand in this conversation, and do you think that it's happening too quickly?
Yeah, to your point, this measure already moved through the Senate just last week. It is moving very quickly. I'm very concerned about it. I voted no on the measure as it advanced through the Senate. Look, I think the important thing to recognize here is that this debate, I don't believe, is about whether or not to increase the minimum wage. It's really about how to do that, when to do that, whether you apply a regionalization factor that might recognize that the cost of living in Peoria is very different than it is in Chicago, which is very different than it is in the very southern parts of our state. This one-size-fits-all proposal that's been advanced, I think, doesn't work for Illinois. So the measure, again, it went through the Senate last week. It goes to the House this week. I think it's critical that House members stand up and recognize that you can't have a one-size-fits-all minimum wage increase. To do so, I think, puts our employers at risk. And employers doesn't just mean our businesses, right? It also includes our not-for-profits, the human service providers that are all around town providing services to those in need. Those services are at risk. Our universities and community colleges who employ student workers may not be able to continue to employ those student workers or may need to raise tuition and fees. K-12, our public school systems are the beneficiary of some additional investment from the state through some of the bipartisan fixes that we've done here recently. Those schools are at risk of having to drive up property taxes as a result of this minimum wage hike that forces them, mandates on them to pay their cooks and nurses and student aid workers more. So I think this is a critical conversation. I think it's one that puts our state and our employers at tremendous risk. And as this thing moves through the House, I hope that we see a more moderate, more reasoned approach to implementing this minimum wage than we've seen thus far.
And within this conversation you talked about, you do think it's going too fast. Kind of go a little bit further into that, because whether it's voted in next week or not, it still would take almost a year for it to be implemented. So why the rush in this case?
You know, the only explanation of why the rush is it's politics, and that's a really unfortunate answer for this type of a significant public policy change. You know, Governor Pritzker, I admit, elections have consequences. He campaigned on this issue, and he's decided to make it accelerate on a very expedited time frame now. He gives a speech on February 20th. It's the budget address mandated by the Illinois Constitution. And Governor Pritzker has said he wants this measure done, meaning passed the General Assembly, but not actually taken effect. He wants the votes taken before his February 20th address. I don't see the urgency in that. I think the legislative process, as it naturally plays out, allows all the stakeholders, again, those schools and not-for-profits and human service providers, it gives them an opportunity to chime in and to weigh in as to whether they think the ramp occurs too quickly or not. It allows them to weigh in on the cost of them doing business in their communities and whether they agree that we should have a regionalized approach to this. That natural legislative process usually results in a significant policy change like this being voted on in May. Pritzker, because again of his desire to get this done before he gives a political speech, has said let's do it right now, which I think is absolutely the wrong approach.
You started off by saying that this is not really an argument about whether or not we should raise the minimum wage. So it sounds like you support the idea of raising it, but just to ask you, because I'm sure you've thought about this, for within your constituency, right, within Central Illinois, regionally, you said regionally should be factored into this. Where would you place the minimum wage if it were to increase? What would be your idea to change that?
Well, my point is to use facts and economics as a guide. We know that when you mandate a minimum wage increase, there's a reaction by those who employ people. I think you need to take that into account. Today, in our state, we have a bifurcated minimum wage system. In Chicago, they pay a higher minimum wage than we do elsewhere in the state, including in Peoria, Bloomington, and around central Illinois. I think a more gradual increase is one that could be absorbed by the employer community. I think that gradual increase could be tied to an index that says here's what the cost of living adjustment is on an annual basis that allows for that wage to grow. I think it could also be tied to an index that accounts for the fact that the cost to do business in Chicago, again, very different than it is in central Illinois. Those guides, I think, should be used for this debate, but the sponsors and Governor Pritzker have said we don't have time for that. We don't want those types of ideas. We want to move forward on a fast track on our idea. They're in the majority. Governor Pritzker won the election. I may not like the decisions that they're making. My point is to communicate a reasoned, more gradual policy that I think could be more, better embraced around our state. They don't want that voice right now, though. What they want to do is push this thing through, again, on an expedited basis, and that seems to be what they're doing.
What would you say to those who argue that this has been a conversation that's been floating around for a long time, and for those who say that if you give people more money, they'll spend more? Because those are the arguments that are coming across when it comes to this. We've been talking about this for so long. It's time to get it done. And if you put more money in people's pockets, they will spend more. Do you agree with that?
Well, look, I do believe that we have been talking about a minimum wage hike for some time. It's why so many of us suggest that it's time to do a minimum wage increase. Again, the details of how much, how it's implemented, a regionalization factor is critical. I represent Illinois State University. I represent 6 counties in central Illinois, including Illinois State University. ISU employs somewhere between 4,000 and 5,000 student workers today. Those workers are being paid a minimum wage. If this law goes into effect, some of those workers aren't going to have a job. And so instead of doing what the sponsors hope, putting more money in their pocket, what they're doing is forcing those student employees to go elsewhere. And if the elsewhere doesn't include a job for them, they're in a real bind as they struggle to pay for tuition and fees, which we know have continually grown and may grow more as a result of this wage increase. So I'm very concerned about how this proposal may be implemented. I think there's an opportunity to take a more reasoned and moderate approach this spring, but Governor Pritzker is going to have to take his foot off the gas pedal and allow for some bipartisan input for that to happen.
All right, let's switch gears. Fair maps last week. All of the, I think almost all were present of the state senator Republicans calling for fair maps within the state of Illinois. This has been also a conversation that's floated around for a while as well, to have an independent committee put together the districting throughout the state of Illinois. Can you clarify just what that would actually mean for people who aren't as clear on that? What that would mean and how would it impact them? And then also, can we actually get this done? Can it actually finally happen?
This is absolutely an idea that can get done. There's broad-based bipartisan support. You'll remember 600 and some thousand people around the state signed petitions saying, we want fair maps. They don't want, like me, they do not want the politicians drawing maps to favor themselves. Rather, they want maps drawn that favor voters. And that's as simple of a statement as it gets. We know that historically the political leaders, Speaker Madigan, Republicans I'm sure have participated in the past, they've drawn maps that are not fair. And so what we propose is to take away that control that the political leaders have and give it to an independent commission. The Illinois Supreme Court gets involved. There's some bipartisanship on that commission. Ultimately, that commission's charge is to follow federal law, the Voting Rights Act and other federal laws, and to draw districts that you and I would say make sense and serve the people of this state in a way that you don't see today. Lots of Democrats support this, and in fact, this measure exists in the Democrat or in the Senate. The measure is on a path to amend our Illinois Constitution to require this independent commission. The measure has, I believe, 9 or 10 Democratic co-sponsors. It has a number 19 Republican co-sponsors, all suggesting that this is a very real bipartisan measure that should see the light of day. Governor Pritzker campaigned on the notion that he was for fair maps. This is an opportunity to put his money where his mouth is. The legislature can make this a reality, and it starts in the Senate, and it starts by encouraging both Republicans and Democrats to help support this measure. I've got it up on my website, www.jasonbarrickman.org. People can see our amendment, they can sign a petition supporting it, and the hope is that that groundswell of public support helps us get this advanced through the legislature this spring.
And you know, there might be people who think anytime you're dealing with either politicians or lawmakers, how can something actually be nonpartisan? Because you look at the people, how they will be selected and those things, but lawmakers who are supporting this truly do believe that this can be an independent group, independent of the influences between Republican and Democrat.
Absolutely, and it's long overdue. You've seen this done in other states. The notion of an independent commission has, again, broad-based support from the public, and the results are telling. You know, there are lawsuits pending all the way up to the U.S. Supreme Court because politicians have gerrymandered their maps so much so that people say they violate the law. I'd rather approach it in Illinois from a different perspective. Let's say right out of the gate, you can't do that. Let's amend our Constitution to tie the hands of politicians, give up this control and give it to this independent commission where the results will be what they'll be. We'll all live with them, but the politicians won't have their own self-interest in a result to what they do. It's a great model that's worked across the country, and it's one that's long overdue in Illinois.
All right, well, let's see. Right now, the pace is very, very quick in Springfield, so let's see if that actually is something that can get done.
I hope it can.
Within this General Assembly. State Senator Jason Barrickman, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, Eugene.